You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 122 for October 25th, 2017. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about job positions. What are the basic positions within a CRM company, and what can you do to move up? So get ready to get some more skills for your professional toolbox because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. You're listening to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, the show that pulls back the veil on topics related to professional archaeology in the United States, but much of what we say may be applicable elsewhere. Please email us your questions at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or find us on social media. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today are Stephen in Calgary.
Hello.
Bill in California.
Good morning.
And Sonia, normally in Utah, but is in transit somewhere in the United States.
I'm in Idaho. Hi.
Nice. Sonia's in a hotel room, so we may get some internet dropout and some weird noises, the maid knocking on the door, something like that. So, just to get it in there. Okay. Well, today we are going to talk about, as I mentioned in the introduction, job positions. And one of the big reasons for this is we've talked about billable rates, and we've talked about other things in the recent past, in the last few episodes, where we've mentioned different job positions within CRM. And I believe, I'll have to look it up because I never did, that I believe we've talked about CRM job positions before on podcast. Maybe not as a primary topic, but we've definitely talked about it before. But this episode, we're going to spend the first segment talking about, at least this is my plan. These guys always go off the rails on me. But anyway, my plan is to talk about the different positions within CRM and the different names you might encounter with those. So if you're an old hat at CRM and you know what you're doing and everything like that, you've been here for a few years and you don't want this segment, skip it segment 2. But either way, the first segment is going to go over all those different positions, and then we'll talk about moving through those positions, moving up, moving down, moving all around, whatever you got to do, what kind of skills you need, what kind of education you need, things like that. And then in the third segment, which is applicable to everyone, I think, is should you move up and should you move around? We all know the career field tech, the people that are just crew chiefs their whole lives and stuff like that, which is nothing wrong with that, and that's what we're going to talk about. So anyway, let's dig into this a little bit. First off, I'm just going to list off the 5 primary positions that I most often see on job positions, and that, quite frankly, I most often see out here in the West, because this is where my the bulk of my experience, I guess, lies. So going from, I guess, for lack of a better way to say this, going from lowest paid to highest paid position. It's not lowest ranked or highest ranked or whatever, but it's typically, from the bottom to the top of the company as you progress up. Field tech, and then crew chief, field director, project manager, and then principal investigator. So I think we'll talk about some variants of what those might mean as we talk through the positions. So let's start with field technician, and we'll just go from there. Sonia, you've hired a lot of people. You've walked all over the country. Have you heard any variations to field technician besides, like, I don't know, scientist 1 or something like that in those bigger companies, or whatever they call it? And what is your ideas on what a field tech even means or what it does?
Well, for the most part, field technicians is just the most basic level, but also one of the more technical levels. So you guys are doing most of the work. And you're doing a lot of the science in the field, other than the laboratory stuff, and sometimes you are doing the lab stuff in the field. Most of the time, we just call them field technicians. Sometimes they're called archaeological technician 1. Sometimes they're called scientist 1 or field scientist 1. It really depends on the company that you're working for and the titles that they've established. Let's not get too caught up in titles, because that can get kind of sketchy, because, sometimes a tech 1 might be considered like an intern, whereas a tech 2 is somebody that has maybe 1 plus years, let's say 1 plus years. And even people with no experience but have a master or a bachelor's degree and a field school. Or a field school, in terms of qualifications, most of the time, an archaeological technician or a field technician has, at minimum, a field school. You can also have bachelor's degrees. You can have master's degrees. You can have a PhD in field tech.
Right.
I've got great stories about field techs with no experience and a PhD coming at me asking for like $80K a year.
Nice. Yeah.
So you never know.
Right.
It's
But the
basically a
basic,
starting point.
yeah, but the basic requirement is typically a degree. Like you said, a lot of people nowadays, it was looser, a while ago, but nowadays it's typically an archaeology or anthropology degree or even a history degree. I've seen, people can get that as long as you have a field school where you learned skills and you can demonstrate that. Then that's kind of one of the big qualifiers. But I'll add to the field tech thing too. I think the field tech is, fundamentally, probably the principal investigator or whoever your business developer is probably the most important person on the team, because that person actually brings work in, and without that person bringing work in, we'll get to that. But without that work, you don't have a business. But then the next important person, which is really high up there, is the field technician, because the field technician has to be highly qualified. I mean, they have to have great amount of knowledge. I mean, we don't give them enough credit for the amount of knowledge a field tech has to have, because we put a person who's green or, relatively new in the field, we'll put them on their own line and say, call out anything you find. And we're just trusting the fact that they know what the hell they're looking for. And they have to know what they're looking for. And if they don't ask questions and be that, engaged and say, well, what do features look like out here? What kind of artifacts am I looking for? Things like that, and understand those things, then that could be a real problem for the project, because you're covering a large swath of land. If you're shovel testing or you're surveying or even you're excavating or something like that, you're covering a portion that nobody else is looking at. And you need to be on your toes to be able to find that stuff. Bill, you had a comment on this.
Yeah, I'm glad that you made that, that you mentioned the fact that field techs need to know a lot of things. And I think there's two things that end up happening. Especially going back to individuals who have a PhD that are starting off as a field tech. If you're a field tech, you need to come in with a beginner's mind, that every single time you're going out there. I mean, I guess all of us really should do that. However, after you've done it for a few years, you kind of have an idea of what to expect. But if you're a field tech, especially because of your position and situation in the company, you should come in with a beginner's mind and willingness to learn more stuff, and always be open to suggestions, so that over time you can take criticism, or you'll be able to filter things out, whether someone knows or doesn't know. And so in the case of someone who has a PhD, that's the hardest part for them to believe, that they need to come in at the ground level and that every single day they need to be starting off and trying to learn what they need to learn. But then the other thing is, if you do go in with a beginner's mind, then you've got to ask a lot of questions. And that can be really exasperating for someone who's higher up in the ladder, who doesn't really have time to, constantly be addressing every single concern, or get to the point where, you think that maybe they're, not learning or not listening, or you just get sick of constantly answering questions. So I guess you kind of have to balance that with the fact that you know a lot, and that your job is the success of the project. So when field techs are constantly asking you questions, they may seem simple, or they may seem like straightforward, obvious, but you need to kind of address them as judiciously and I guess politely as possible, because this person learning more and more is the key to your success. And a long time ago, someone told me that, I can't remember who it was, but it was someone in the field. They told me that their job or their goal in their career is for everyone under them to one day take their job away. Because if they were teaching everyone everything that they knew in a way that one day they wouldn't have to, do that job, then basically they were training their next replacement, and they were teaching the people that they have the skills that they need to move up in the company.
Yep.
And likewise, that forced them to always learn more skills, because eventually the people under them would know most of what they knew. And so if they didn't learn anything else new, their job would eventually get taken away. So I always thought that was good advice. And, I always pray for the day that I get to sit there out in the field underneath a canopy, with a mint julep or something like that, while everyone else does everything. But that never ends up happening, because as I do more and they learn more, then I have to do even more or different things. So,
right.
Trying to keep up with, I guess, the young up and coming folks is a constant balancing act for the management.
I'd like to add that field technicians are the foundation of all cultural resources businesses. You are our starting point. You are the basis, and truly the foundation of our business. If we don't train you the way that we want to get the work done, that's our fault. But when you guys execute the work in the field and you do it at great quality and a timeliness, it builds the business's reputation and it builds your reputation as well. And I'll tell you, this is such a small community, archaeology, that you want word to get around that you are a hard worker and that you are willing to help, doing whatever you can. Businesses are built on the reputations of their crews, not necessarily their project managers and their owners. So I can have the most stellar, most awesome reputation in the world, but that doesn't mean anything if my crew isn't the foundation of my business, if they're not working hard.
Right.
So you guys are critical. And when I'm saying you guys, I'm not talking about, Chris and Bill and Steve. I'm talking about you guys, our listeners, our field technicians and our crew chiefs and our field directors.
That's right.
You guys are critical. So remember that, you're the important foundation of our business.
Yeah, I mean, they're also the face of the company in most cases. I mean, sometimes out here, like in the West, we're in the middle of nowhere, no one ever sees us. But a lot of times, especially back east and things like that, you're really close to the public. You're really close to roads and populations and things like that. And what they see you doing and how they see you behaving is the face of the company, and then sometimes is the face of archaeology, like professional archaeology.
I got it. Can I tell a story?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure, why not?
I was out on a field project in southern Utah many years ago, and I was working with this field technician who was a big prankster. And his pranks extended not just to the field directors and the project managers and the other field techs on the project, but to members of the community. And I had to get after him, especially after he scared the living crap out of a woman in a Walmart.
Jeez. Just
by saying boo really loud. Scared the crap out of her. I mean, honestly, if I had been in that position, I probably would have accidentally shot him. He scared the living daylights out of her, and I had to reprimand him. And he was walking back to a truck that had the name of the business plastered all over it. I mean, honestly, if you can't be mature enough to behave yourself in front of the public, how can I trust people to behave in front of their crew or anyone else? Honestly, it stunned me. So, your professionalism is critical in developing the business, but also developing your professionalism and your future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we spent most of this segment on field tech because, like you guys both said, it's foundational, and it's where everything starts and where everybody starts. I mean, very few people were never field techs. That was one of the craziest things I saw over when I was working in the southern United States. Is people who were never field technicians coming out of college. They went from a bachelor's degree to their master's degree, right into a project manager position, and because that's just kind of how it works out there, and that was really weird to me. It doesn't really work that way out here in the West, unless you maybe know somebody or you got a lot of experience. Maybe you interned with somebody when you were in college and you got some experience, and you come out with a graduate degree and then they make you a project manager or something. I guess that could happen, but it's less likely. I mean, you're gonna pay your dues as a field tech out here in the West before you move up. Typically, again, we're speaking in generalities here. There's always exceptions to the rule. But let's move on so we can cover some of these other spots. We're kind of doing the theory between first and second segment today in one. So we'll probably take both of those segments to move through all these positions, and then we'll get into a little more philosophical discussion in the third segment. But the next step up from crew chief, field tech typically is crew chief. And at its basic sense, a crew chief on one variation that you see commonly out here in the West is you'll have typically a crew of maybe 4 people. And I think most of the reason it's based on 4 people is partly the number of tasks required to record a site is applicable to 4 people, although I think 3 people is more suited to that. But also, you can fit 4 people comfortably in a vehicle. And I think that's really where the 4-person crew comes from, is putting 4 people in a vehicle. You put 3 people in a vehicle, and it just seems inefficient because you've got an extra space there. So we put 4 people in a vehicle, and then we have a crew. Well, that crew needs a leader. So all of these next positions start diverging slightly from field work and actual technical tasks to more management tasks. And the higher you move up, the bigger that management wedge gets, right? And the bigger the I guess the theoretical wedge gets too, because if you're starting to do some report writing and things like that, your field time versus your office time are starting to change, but also your management responsibilities start to increase as you go up. So a crew chief at its basic level is a manager of at least 3 other people on their crew. And that is the person who, any of the gaps in knowledge that the field techs have, any of the things that they don't know, the crew chief really should know. The crew chief shouldn't know everything strictly, because as a leader, they should understand and rely on the strengths of their people at every level. But theoretically, the crew chief is the one that everybody else goes to ask questions of. So the crew chief has to be a highly trained person, know the area, not just know archaeology and be, they could have 10 years in the field, but if they don't know the archaeology of this area that they're working in, they probably shouldn't be a crew chief right away, unless they have highly trained crews and they know how to use them and they're effective leaders. So anyway, Bill, what are some of your experiences with different types of crew chiefs? I know they kind of do things a little differently when you worked in Arizona too.
Yeah, well, also just I don't know about the 5-person thing. Sometimes you don't even actually get 4 other people to help you with the project. Sometimes it's just you and one other person for safety, and one of them goes, "Hey, you want to be crew chief today? Well, let's flip a coin. You be crew chief, right?" Well, that only works if people have experience. But I've worked on projects where there were big excavation areas and 8 or 9 people, and there's only one person who's the crew chief. But then again, that also matters for how much you're getting paid. So if the crew chief position gets a higher salary, then there's a discrepancy there. But if everybody that's working out there is all salary anyway, then it doesn't really matter so much who's crew chief and who's not. That's just the person who ends up having to do all the time cards and get all the money for the per diem and handle all the correspondence between the hotel and answer all the emails, do all the extra archaeology that happens after the archaeology.
Right.
Following up on what Bill said, up here, the permit holder, who's basically the PI, has to have a minimum amount of time in the field. So usually they're the functional crew chief, and they get assigned someone to be basically the sidekick, if there's only the 2 people. So as far as who's in charge, it's pretty much laid out by who's carrying the permit. But a lot of times, both of them are, qualified to be permit holders. So, you could go from one project where someone has a permit and the next project, the other person has a permit, and you're just kind of, it's whoever's project and whoever's taken along.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Stephen. I was on a project for Sonia that was much like that. I actually had the permit, but the person she had out there was running the project. And I was like, oh, glory, thanks be to whoever you pray to that I can just sit here and be a field tech, kind of. It was amazing. I loved it.
Interesting.
That was the julep. You finally got julep in the shade, but I've never gotten that. I've never gotten that.
Interestingly, he actually received his permit literally like 2 days before the project started. And by that time I was like, it
was too late.
You're already signed on. You can go ahead. And
hey, I was more than happy to just be a field tech for a while and just say, where do we go now? What are we doing now? I'm not making any decisions.
And he's a very good manager too. He's a very
he was really good
field manager.
Yeah, it was nice to work for somebody that had a similar mind and could, not send us on a wild goose chase for transects and make weird shapes, but actually do things logically. It all worked out really well.
Good.
All right. Well, we're going to take a break, and then we'll pick this up on the other side and just keep running through the positions. Back in a second. Hey everyone, the CRM Arc podcast has been going solid for almost 5 years now. In that time, we've covered a lot about the business and the culture of CRM. Well, it's time for a fresh perspective. We're looking for a new co-host that can commit to just one recording every 2 weeks. We know you're in the field and can't make them all, but most is okay. You have to be able to communicate via the Slack app and add your ideas to the Trello app, both available on smartphones and via a web browser. So if you got some ideas and want to talk about them, send me an email at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or find me on social media at archpodnet. That's ARCHPODNET. That's chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or at archpodnet. Okay, we're back. And, we were talking about crew chiefs when we left the break. We're talking about field positions in general on a CRM archaeology crew or really within a company, because we're going to go all the way to the top in this podcast. And I will like to point out, we're not strictly talking about pay or anything like that in these because it's such a wide variation in all this, but it is relatively understood that each one of these positions should come with a slight increase in pay. I'll tell you right now, though, the increase in pay is not directly proportional to the increase in responsibilities because especially with crew chief, like Sony was saying, and I think Bill was saying, handling the hotel and handling some other stuff that crew chiefs are usually expected to do. Sometimes that's only for an extra like 50 cents an hour, or if you're salaried with the company, when you start moving beyond crew chief, you start moving into potential full-time and salary positions, even at the crew chief level. Then you might have a significant increase, even if it's just in benefits. It might not just be in your hourly rate or something like that. So we're not going to strictly talk about that in this episode because it's not really about that. But just know that, there should be a small increase and sometimes there's a bigger increase. But once you start getting like over crew chief, you then really kind of start doing some negotiations as well into those higher management positions, or at least you should. So anyway, so some variants on the crew chief. Sonia, you were mentioning, the roles of a crew chief in the West versus in the East, because like we said, in the West, you might only be running a crew of 2-3 people, or like Bill and Steven said, just one other person, and one of you just decided, okay, I'm the crew chief for the day, because somebody has to kind of be in charge. You need that structure. But in the East, it could be very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For example, I've got a crew of about 11 people working in the Southeast right now. On a fairly large job, and 10 or 11 people is a large number of people for one person to manage. So I've got my field director out there. He's managing most of the administrative stuff. He's handling all of the hotel, all of the timesheets and planning for the days, and then he divvies out responsibilities to his crew chiefs, to the 2 crew chiefs. And those 2 crew chiefs then supervise the remainder of the crew. And then at the end of the day, collect all the data and bring it back to the field director so everything can be downloaded and processed and plans can be made for the next day. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the field director is not out in the field with them. In fact, he is. But in some cases, he needs to step away in order to communicate with the client, communicate with the project manager, and that sort of thing. So he may be out working, but there's someone who's managing the job and yet still in the field, assisting the field crew. And in that case, that's the field director. So the crew chiefs are actually the ones supervising the different crews. And many times those responsibilities can fall to the crew chiefs. Crew chiefs and field directors are often an exchangeable term, sometimes in the Southeast. Sometimes the field director is the project manager. It just really depends on how the project is set up. So
I've often seen field directors as kind of, if they're not actually the project manager and they're just being called a field director, I've often seen a field director as like a crew chief of the crew chiefs. Like they're the super crew chief that's out there. They're who the crew chiefs come to for their crew assignments for the day, but they're not necessarily managing the project. They're just managing the field work on a larger fieldwork project with many crews.
Yeah, and when you have multiple crews working, when you have 10, 15, 20, 40 archaeologists all working, your field director, you may have a couple of field directors working under a project manager, depending on the number. Those people are largely doing administrative work, but they're also doing field work. And they're also fielding some questions or concerns or HR issues, timesheets, accidents, if accidents happen in the field. So, just because your field director's out there with you, maybe you have a crew of 4, you're probably out there with either a crew chief or a field director, depending on how the permit is set up. So, it's not really the important thing to remember on this, but in some areas, when they say crew chief, like in the Southeast, they may actually be referring to a field director, which is more common in the West.
Right.
So one of the things I like to remind my crews is to read the list of responsibilities for the position that you are applying for. Because if you're not ready to do management experience, management tasks, and you're applying for a crew chief position, or you think you're applying for a crew chief position, that might be something to take into consideration.
Yeah, that is one thing I don't think enough people take into consideration is they think they're the best archaeologist on the planet when it comes to, knowledge of the cultures involved and things like that. And that might be the case. But if you can't manage people, you shouldn't be managing people. You need to learn how to do that. You need to learn from people who are doing it, learn what they do right, learn what they do wrong, and take those experiences. Go ahead, Sonia.
Yeah, one other thing that I'd like to add about this is I've worked with a lot of field technicians who want to move into the crew position. And a tip that I'd like to give you is this. If you feel like you need to bicker behind the scenes or stir up trouble, you're not ready to be a crew chief. These positions take leadership, and leadership takes responsibility and behaving differently than a field technician might. That means that you may not be able to go to the bar every night and hang out with everybody and gripe about the project. You need to take a more professional leadership position. So if you can't do that, like your project manager, like my field directors, they notify me about who does good work, who's stirring that turd in the background, what's going on. I am reluctant to elevate people who've worked with me before into crew chief or even field director positions simply because they're not ready in terms of maturity or leadership. So keep that in mind.
To build on what Sonia's saying, I think that another thing that kind of shows that you're ready to be a crew chief, or something that most of us higher ups would notice, is if you are thinking about how you would run a project. So there can be a fine line between bitching and talking about like, well, if this were mine, I'd be doing it this different way. But by having that kind of like mental involvement, a lot of times, the bosses will pick up on that. Like you are actually interested in what's going on, and you are thinking about, what works and what doesn't. And that kind of, stands out. And the other thing is, if you become kind of the, just kind of a natural, you kind of naturally rise to that point where, you're helping out your fellow field techs and stuff like that. If you're taking more responsibility, even though, you don't have a crew chief position, you're not doing anything, you're just kind of doing it just to do it because you know how that company's processes work or whatever, then, that kind of stands out as well. Again, that doesn't mean that, you start trying to counteract what, the other crew chiefs are saying or the bosses are saying or stuff like that, and you're not whining about it. But if you're showing that level of, thinking and actions towards your project, then, the bosses do notice that stuff, even if they're not necessarily mentioning that.
I've got a follow-up comment to what Stephen was just saying. Just recently, I've been doing some work in Idaho with a small team of 4 people, myself included, and I didn't have a crew chief on this team, and I wish I had. But I found that one of the field technicians, all of them were excellent, and all of them could very well be crew chiefs in the near future. This one field technician, and as I recall, he's got maybe 6 months to a year worth of experience, made good decisions, spoke up, gave suggestions, and offered solutions to issues that I was having. And not with crew, just situational issues, like snow, that sort of thing. So, when you start stepping up like that as a field tech, people notice and people start going, okay, you are making the right decisions. You are providing good solutions. You're not stirring up trouble. You are going to be a good leader in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So we do notice. And even if I only work with this guy for like 10 days, I can definitely tell you that if somebody calls me and asks for a reference for him, he will get a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of times, especially when I was first starting out, I was placed in management or control of things, whether I was ready or not. And so kind of how you handle that plays another big role, because especially if you're working for a company that has more than one project going at the same time, they may not have time to hire a whole new crew for every single thing. So certain individuals may be pulled off of the project that you're working on. And a lot of times that ends up being some of the crew chiefs, because they've got to go manage another project and get that one up and going. So you may end up in a situation where you're a field tech, but you're actually kind of just doing all the crew chief stuff, because I guess maybe they've identified aptitude, or maybe there's no one else that can do it. And so how you perform in a situation where, I know everybody's heard this before, well, that's not my job. That's not even my job. I'm not even supposed to be doing that. Well, the people who step up and do that job are the ones who get moved up to the next level. And those who kind of gripe about how they're having to do more work, or that's more than their quota, those are the folks who don't get that opportunity again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? And there are some companies out there, my own included, that will reward you for that. I have actually provided bonuses without even telling people that I provide bonuses on their
Nice.
paychecks, because of their stepping up.
Mm-hmm.
And whether they noticed it or not, I threw it in there because I felt like they were really stepping up on the project.
Okay. Well, I feel like we have covered, through covering crew chief, we've kind of talked about field director quite a bit as somewhat of a variant of project manager and crew chief. But let's move into project manager. Up until this point as well, I feel like in a lot of places in the country, you can have up through like field director position, probably with just an undergraduate degree and not a master's degree. That's not to say everywhere. And some people with degree inflation are seeing a lot more master's degrees in the lower positions. So, but in general, as far as a job requirement on a job listing goes, you're probably going to, you're more than likely to not see master's degree on those positions. But like I said, just depends on where you're at and what the job is and how many people you're in charge of. Who knows? But project manager is where you first typically do see master's degree guaranteed. It's unlikely to not see that in a job posting. So now that being said, because we're talking about requirements for these now, but let's talk about project manager first. Project manager is typically the person who is given the project by the principal investigator in a larger company. Sometimes the principal investigator is the project manager in a smaller company, but in medium to larger companies, you'll have one or a couple PIs at the top, and then you'll have project managers, and they're the PIs and the business developers are bringing in the business, and they're giving these projects to the project managers. And the project manager is in charge of managing the budget, managing the field work, managing the timelines, making sure they get they might delegate some of these tasks, but they're in charge of making sure they get the crew settled. They hire all the crew members. They figure out where they're going. They figure out the field schedule. They get the permits in place. They do all that stuff, and then they may manage the crew in the field, or they may have a field director, or they may manage from the office and only go out there a couple times. Who knows? Just depends on where you're at. And then they also will be in charge of writing the report. Again, they may delegate some of these tasks, but they're probably going to do the bulk of the analysis of the report writing, the conclusions and things like that. They may delegate out some of the other tasks to other people in the office, but they're responsible for making sure it all gets done. So that's typically project manager, and like I said, typically also requires a master's degree. But the one variation I mentioned on that is definitely Nevada. You can move up through experience into even principal investigator here in Nevada. You probably won't get a permit to start your own firm without a graduate degree, unless it's a really special case and you just, you're really an amazing person. But with experience, you can get a PI permit for work on Nevada BLM land with just experience and an undergraduate degree and not a master's degree. So that is the one place where you can do that. And there's probably other places where there's different rules and regulations to that, but I know for a fact in Nevada, that's the case. So if you're highly opposed to a graduate degree for some reason, but still want to move up through the ladder, come to Nevada and just start getting experience, and you'll move up the chain if you want to. So guys, what are some variations to project manager? Sonia, how do you run? You're a relatively small company, and you're out in the field a lot. So how do you differentiate between project principal investigator and project manager on your projects?
They're all me right now. That's actually not true. My senior field director and field manager, Robert, he is an excellent manager and is fully qualified to run crews and get his own permits. And basically, what I do is I hand him a project and I say, "Here you go, take care of it. I'll do the background stuff. I'll do all the administrative work. You can run the rest of it."
Test.
And he'll follow up with me, usually every day or every couple of days, just saying, "We are busting ass on this. We are getting it taken care of. I better get a bonus this year," or something like that. It depends on how we performed overall, but
So in your size of a company, you're more of a team than really. Yeah. I mean, you're ultimately the PI. You're the one running the company. You're the one at the top that's responsible for everything. But as far as individual tasks goes on projects, you're kind of running a team sort of environment.
I am.
Yeah.
And we try to operate as a team. I mean, I can tell you on the business side what is legal and what is not legal, and what we can do and what we can't do ethically. In terms of accomplishing the project, I work with my field directors and my crew to come up with a realistic schedule, and I ask them to buy into it. So I am not the one that's saying, "Oh, you can get this 1,000 acres of survey done in 3 days, no problem." You know what I mean? I am assisting them in putting the cost estimates together. Sometimes I put them together, but then we always talk and I say, realistically, do you think you can get this done in that amount of time and for this cost? So we want to make sure that I'm not being out of touch with the field crew, because I know that's a huge issue for field crews and management. Just like they feel the management is out of touch with reality.
Right.
So, and then additionally, sometimes I kind of go in as undercover boss. So literally I put Robert in charge, and then I'm just out there field teching like the rest of you.
There you go. Nice.
I'm out digging holes. I'm out doing survey, whatever.
Yeah. Sometimes it's nice, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's very, and you learn a lot. You learn how crews are operating, how different people work, the dynamic. And it's very refreshing. and sometimes you learn, crap, maybe I didn't do that right.
Yeah.
So it's very helpful, I've found. But yes, you are right. We tend to operate more as a team. And then basically once I take in everybody's feedback, I make a decision. I go, okay, this is how we're going to move forward.
Okay.
But we're a small business. Big and medium-sized businesses work completely different. And I've worked for both.
Right.
And I can tell you that they are definitely run differently. So the administrative hassles that project managers have to deal with in multi-billion-dollar corporations, or even multi-million-dollar corporations that have tens of offices, is completely different than the way that I operate with my business that has like 3 offices.
Right.
And they're all small. You know what I mean?
The one thing I want to say is, for most of us, that's the end game. When you make it to that level, that's pretty much as far as you're going to make it. Because if you think about it, there's only a few PIs and company owners at every company or any company. It usually takes multiple decades for you to be a decent PI and to not ruin things, and for you to be in good shape. So for a lot of us, the field director stage is going to be, as far as you really get. And you may get to that point where you decide that you don't want to go any higher because you can see how much hassle you already have. And the fact that when you go to the PI, a lot of times at most companies, you never go outside anymore.
Yeah, and that's one thing we're gonna focus on in the third segment is should you stay or should you go? I think that's a song about that. Anyway, but moving into PI, Bill, like you said, principal investigator, depending on the company, I mean that's what we call the Tesla level, right, Sonia? No, so PI is typically,
Yeah.
in a smaller company, the PI could be in the field and is more than likely in the field. I was in the field. Sony's in the field. We're small companies though. We don't really have, a whole bunch of people around us. But the more projects you start doing, the more things you start having, the more those people at the top, the PIs, start changing their positions just a little bit. You might break PI out into as your company starts to grow, you'll first start breaking it out into project managers. Now you've taken those tasks and you're calling some of the things you did project managers. And then you get a little bigger, you might have a business developer. You might have somebody whose sole job is to just write proposals, schmooze, and go find work. And then you've still got PIs at the top. And then you might even break out into additional PIs. So you've got so many projects that you're running, you need more principal investigators because they can't oversee the projects that they have. And then you keep moving up, and you might even have like a company president that's over PIs, and the company president or whoever the people are, or the person that's running the show at the top, they're more in the corporate atmosphere. They're more in the I honestly don't know what they do in those bigger companies. They're just trying to work. They're kind of in business development, but they're also just like, working with other companies and trying to make bigger deals and working with clients, as Stephen is saying in the background here. And they're doing the big time stuff that's theoretically keeping the company going. They're not just out golfing and spending the company's money. They're trying to keep everything going. So that's typically what you do there. So anyway, when we get up into that level, though, you're really talking about a huge amount of variation and in what people do and what's going on. I would still say, though, generally in CRM, the typical degree requirements are a graduate degree, typically a master's degree, but in some of these bigger companies, the ones where competition is tighter for these positions, it's often a PhD. That you're going to need to get in there. And it doesn't mean you need a PhD to do that job. They're just trying to, limit their pool of people and only, take so many. So they just increase the requirements to get in, which just does that naturally. So anyway, there's a lot more we could say on this, and we've gone a little long on this segment because the next one's going to be a little shorter. But we're going to come in and talk about a little more of the philosophy of moving around within CRM positions, and should you or should you not try to move up, depending on who you are and what you're doing, and what the advantages and disadvantages of each. So we'll be back in a second.
In CRM, a weekly podcast. Ask CRM professionals 8 simple questions. The first questions establish education, location, and experience. The last questions are a reflection of that experience, and the answers will surprise you. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/profiles. On that page, you can also request to be interviewed for the show. It only takes 20 minutes, and you don't need any special equipment. Let's get back to the show.
Okay, we're back, and this is segment 3, and we're talking about job positions. So let's see if we can't just sum up what we did and maybe add another comment or so. Stephen, you had something to say about permitting. I don't know if that comment is still relevant, but if you want to kind of finalize the last 2 segments with your comment about permitting and PIs and things like that, then now's your chance.
Up here in Canada, and particularly Alberta, there's a strong permitting process. So if you're doing archaeology at all, you have to get permits and stuff like that. And in Alberta, at least, the permit requires a minimum percentage of field time that you actually have to be there to do the project in the field. So a lot of times your PIs are also basically the field director. There's no field director position. You're either, the field archaeologist doing the field tech stuff and doing the work, or you're essentially the field director PI. And there's no, so there's less, in some ways, there's kind of less grades between positions, that you don't slowly work your way up. You spend a lot of time at that base level. And then, when you get your master's degree or doctorate or whatever, and the requisite experience, you can apply to, to be approved for a permit.
All right. Well, that's actually a pretty good transition, because you mentioned a lot of things in there that are related to the topic of permitting. And that just brings it up for people, is it worth, like you're saying, let's just say hypothetically, somebody needs a graduate degree to get X permit wherever they're working, right? They've got to get this permit. They have to get a graduate degree. You don't just go down to freaking Walmart and get a graduate degree. Well, some people do, but no, you don't just go down and just grab a graduate degree. Bill, Sonia, Stephen, we've all got graduate degrees. Bill, you've got your PhD now, and you're, a college professor. I mean, that wasn't something easy to do, and you don't just go get one. So is it worth it is the question. And you just have to ask yourself, for your own purposes, when you're getting into this field, you have to kind of look at where you want to go. And for some people, it might be worth it. For some people, it might not be. Some people might not ever want to have massive amounts of responsibility, having that stress. They may not handle stress well. They might just want to be a field technician, find stuff, dig holes, and do things. And we all know people like that. But everybody on this call seems to be driven to move up in some way, because we all have. I don't know if that just happened accidentally or not, but we've all moved up, or we wouldn't be here on the show. So, Bill, you've got a comment on this.
Yeah. If you think that you're just going to be able to get hired to dig holes and stay there for many years, that is almost never a successful approach, because eventually your body will become, I guess, not really decrepit, but a lot like mine, with scoliosis, and, your knees don't really do the same thing. And all those years of using a breaker bar to smash through rocks and stuff, that picks up, right? And so I don't care how physically fit you are. There's going to be this time when you just can't dig, or you can't walk as fast. And when it gets to that point, there's this, constant wave of young, aspiring, intelligent, dedicated individuals who want to do archaeology. And over time, that degree requirement, that experience requirement, all that stuff's going to catch up to you. So if you don't move forward and get some kind of a certification, like an MBA, an accounting degree, an online master's in history, something that you can actually give back in another way to your company, I just have seen it happen so many times before, that amazing people who have a ton of experience but only a bachelor's, they're continually passed up. They're forced to take more and more marginal jobs, and their career is really stunted because they don't have that graduate degree. So I guess it matters on what you want for your career. However, at a certain point, I strongly urge people to look into a master's, because in archaeology, with this level of degree inflation, it's very hard to stay alive. It's just a field tech.
So that is definitely some of the disadvantage to staying in a field position. I won't just limit it to field tech, because you could be a crew chief, you could be a field director, depending on where you're at. In the one thing we didn't really mention in the first and second segments, where a lot of what we were talking about was based on survey crews, whereas over in the East, where they do a lot of excavation, you might not even have crew chiefs for a 15-20 person crew. You might just have a field director or the project manager managing all those people. So, but either way, it's a field position. And, I guess the disadvantage to, like you said, Bill, to maintaining a field position as your career is you're going to destroy your body over time. I mean, it's just like any other job, like sports and things like that, where if you work outside and you don't keep on top of your physical fitness and your health, then you're just going to wear things down. And even if you do keep on top of it, you're going to slowly wear things down.
In some ways, it's like a job like sports, but it's more actually like a job like construction.
Yeah, for sure.
How many 50 to 60-year-old roofers do you see out there? Mm-hmm. How many do you see laying concrete? And if you see them that they're that age, what are they doing? They're managing the younger people. And so when it comes to archaeology, in order to get to that next management level, you have to have a graduate degree in most areas.
I have heard comments, since I moved up here, that because the permit holder, essentially the PI is required to be out in the field, it kind of stunts the career paths for a lot of people because, like Bill was saying, and I really like that construction analogy. It's like there is a certain point where, you're going to get beat up, and I'm not there yet, but who knows? It could be 5 years from now, it could be 10 years from now. Maybe if I'm really, really lucky, it never ever happens. But the concern is if the top end of the stick, the PI has to be out in the field. What is there beyond that?
Right.
There is no that at the top of the pyramid. Like the company presidents or whatever that deal with the clients. There aren't enough positions open for all the people who would necessarily need to move into that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a potential, I don't know, like consideration for, your long-term career path. Are you thinking about other careers that maybe you have to, kind of move laterally into or something?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, that's what we're talking about in this segment too. And like, let's take the person who just graduated in May and they're just finishing up their first summer as a field technician in CRM archaeology. They're living the dream. They're getting paid to do archaeology. What are their prospects? What do they need to be looking at? Is it basically what we're saying is if they don't move up, if they don't eventually go get a graduate degree and eventually move up the chain, that they're looking at maybe a 15, maybe 20 year, if they really take care of themselves, maybe a 15 or 20 year career in archaeology, and then they've got to move laterally into something else. This is why people go get GIS certificates and stuff like that, so they can now sit in an office and finish out their career doing GIS. But what are the other options besides that? You guys are all agreeing with this in the comments, but so somebody who doesn't want to move into a management position, let's just say, because we all know that that's where you go to get in the office and to save your body, is you get a graduate degree, you move into management, you move up for that chain. But what if you want to be in archaeology right now, you just graduated, and you're not so hot on management right now, and let's just say you never change and you don't want to be? What are your options? Should you go find another career right now? Or should you risk damaging your body over the next 15 or 20 years and then find another career? What do you guys think?
Yeah, here's my thought on that. Is that if you are happy being a field tech, and we all know people who are, we know people who are in their 50s and they're still, basically being a field tech, and they're actually, pleased as punch, right? That's what they want. Great. I don't think any of us are, are trying to dissuade any of you who, want to be field techs to, no, you must stop being a field tech. No, go ahead. But don't let the door close on you. And the idea is that a lot of times, and I think we've all done this, because we don't really think long term about our career paths so much as we just do one thing, move to the next thing, and then all of a sudden it's been 20 years. You only have experience as a field tech. Maybe you've done crew chief a couple times. You have no grad degree, and finally after 20 plus years, you're like, man, I can't do this anymore. Mm-hmm. But you're stuck because, like Bill was talking about, you've worked your way and the doors have started to close because you weren't thinking about what you need to do to keep that open. Right. And so I would encourage people, if they think they're going to stay in the career, if they're going to stay in the industry, that they should make sure that those future doors stay open, and that is to have get that grad degree. Even if you're not planning on, moving up, if get that grad degree, and actually I would recommend that you get that grad degree because you want to be better archaeologist. It's not just a bunch of hoops to get you a piece of paper. And if you think it is, then that was probably a really crappy program. You go there to learn more things. I'm sure that Bill in his professorial duties is like working to make, to teach people to be better archaeologists, even if they already have field experience, right?
Yeah, you're right. And I agree totally with the college experience. You're right.
Yeah, so so work on that, and improve those skills, and find your peripheral side hustles that apply, like the GIS, or become really good at, maybe you're the faunal expert, maybe you're the ceramics expert, maybe develop those specialties, and that gives you opportunities for future doors to open or stay open.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I don't know how many times we've mentioned that on this podcast, is get other skills. Even if you don't end up really using them as a career or something like that, they still make you more marketable, and they still make you a better archaeologist, gaining these other skills, even, and it doesn't have to be technical skills. I'm glad you mentioned that, Stephen. Become a faunal expert and learn that stuff on your own. And you don't have to go to college for it necessarily, but you can learn that stuff. You can look for positions where, or volunteer for positions where that might be a place to gain information, to gain knowledge. And then when the time comes to to start thinking about moving laterally, because maybe you're having a family, maybe maybe you are beat down, maybe you just had back surgery, you got to do something else. I worked with a guy that had prior to working with us, he'd had 4 bypasses, like heart bypasses. And he's like, we're walking in the hot desert and he's practically bending over after just like a few hundred meters because he can't breathe. And I'm like, my God, are you going to have a heart attack right here? Like, you need to be out of the field. Go do something else. And you don't want to get to that point. So, but let's talk about the person who's been doing this for 5-6 years right now. They've been a field tech. Maybe they've had a couple crew chief opportunities, and they're starting to think, well, why am I not moving up? What's the time frame for this? What's a good time frame for somebody who just graduated to think, when should you be crew chiefing? When should you be field directing? And when should you be thinking about getting your master's degree? Like, how much time should you spend before you go get that master's degree and then start moving up into those other positions? Or let's even say you have your master's degree, you did all that. How long before you can start expecting some project management responsibilities and things like that? And how much time do you give it before you realize you're the problem and nobody's going to hire you for that because maybe you're not right for it? You might have all the things on paper to look good, but you're just not the right person to be a leader. I mean, sometimes that just happens. I don't know. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah. About that, I've noticed, and we've talked about this for years, or at least however many years we've been doing 122 episodes, that there is a massive bottleneck of skills and expertise for moving up or even getting positions, and you throughout the U.S. and probably elsewhere as well, where everybody's got a master's, everybody's walking around in their mid-30s or older, because they're the ones who had the positions and they're just not letting them go because there's nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. So I hesitate to say that if you're not moving up, you're the problem, because it could very well just be that there are no positions.
It could be.
Like, you could be as good or better as I was in your shoes, 20 years ago. But, when I was there were places to move up to. Mm-hmm. Right now that is becoming slimmer and slimmer. And particularly, like Alberta's having a very, part of that business cycle, we're having our down year. And so there aren't a lot of positions open.
Yeah.
It's so, I mean, yeah, do consider that, like, am I doing something wrong? But mm-hmm. It's entirely possible that you're not. And that's a whole different can of worms about, when to consider getting out of archaeology. Like, if there aren't any jobs,
yeah,
at what point do you just, cut out and do something else?
Yeah. If you've reached a ceiling and you're tired of doing what you're doing and there's literally nowhere to go and you're not looking at more skills, then yeah, maybe it is time to move on and think about something else. And I will say, as far as moving up goes, sometimes because there are so many people down trying to claw their way up, you have to sometimes be a little aggressive about it. Every early crew chief position I got, honestly, when I did not deserve to be a crew chief from an experience standpoint. Some of the first couple times I was a crew chief on projects, I should not have been a crew chief because I didn't know enough about the archaeology of the area. I had some leadership skills, but I didn't feel like that was enough to make me right for the job. But I was constantly saying, so what do you do to get up to be crew chief? What is this? What is that? I was putting myself out there. I was being annoying, and I was saying, listen, I'd like to be a crew chief. I want to do this and I want to do that. I want to move up into those positions. And then when that time came, I got advanced in front of some other people that actually had way more experience than I did, but they weren't as vocal about it. So sometimes you just have to be annoying. But if you get annoying to the point, we're just going to overlook you. So anyway, it's a delicate balance. Anyway, this has been a great discussion, and I'm glad we had it. And I'm glad we had the slight philosophical bent at the end. It was really good. So if you've got questions, please feel free to ask us, Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com, or find us on all the socials. Most of our social media handles are in the show notes for the episode. And go over there and check that out. And we want to hear your guys' experience. What are your trials and tribulations? What are your questions? What are your, are you new in the field? Are you old in the field and you want to, move on and you just don't know how? You want to ask us a question and we can discuss it on the show and maybe help you out, then send those in and we'll do that. So anyway, thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for the episode. You can also email me at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag CRMArcPodcast, or you can tag @ArcPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to the show wherever you saw it. If you share CRM archaeology related items on Twitter or Facebook or anywhere else for that matter, be sure to use the hashtag CRMArc so the community can see and comment. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Also, please consider donating to the Archaeology Podcast Network. Your donations help fund our bandwidth and contribute to our editing costs. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Adios.
Did I hear Steven? Was he in there?
Yeah,
He was.
Okay.
Yeah, we all went in.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.